Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
I had a whole bunch of people send me this article, including a guy this morning who emailed me and said, Steve, check out the article here. The Institute for Justice is trying to get people to take over your job. So ironically, that group of people you're always pushing, they're going to hurt your business. And no, they're not. I support this. And so the Institute for Justice is now fighting in New York for the right for people to give out advice who aren't lawyers, but they aren't talking about going into court and representing somebody. They're talking about somebody who's active in the community, just giving out simple advice to people with legal problems. And so I understand there's a distinction between, legal advice that could hurt somebody or simple legal advice, and there might be an issue with that, but we'll get to that. But we're talking about the right to provide legal advice, and this is an article from the Institute for Justice regarding a lawsuit that they have filed in the state of New York. So they point out that when wealthy Americans face legal troubles, they have a lot of resources to find advice. Legions of lawyers, business consultants, accountants, and others stand ready to provide their expertise for a price. But for many Americans who may lack the means to employ those experts, their only option is to turn to their friends, family, or other community members, like their pastors. And that's been the experience for a reverend in Bronx whose congregants turn to him for advice when they have trouble. Sometimes their troubles are spiritual, sometimes marital, sometimes legal. Like many New Yorkers, his parishioners sometimes get sued and they don't know what to do. Now understand that a lot of the lawsuits, a lot of them are about consumer debt. In fact, many of the lawsuits in New York, roughly a quarter of them are lawsuits to collect on a debt. So in a given year, some 300,000 people in New York City alone will be hit with a debt lawsuit. So I've had people tell me, Steve, these ambulance chasing attorneys are clogging up the courts with these stupid slip and fall lawsuits. No, it's debt collectors. Debt collectors have been number one for decades. Debt collectors are the ones who file the most lawsuits. So many of these lawsuits are questionable, brought by third parties that buy up old debts on the secondary market and file suits to collect, even if the defendant doesn't owe the amount claimed. Sometimes they don't owe anything at all. Sometimes they got the wrong person. Sometimes the debts are so old they're uncollectible. Doesn't matter. People file lawsuits. So despite the fact that many of the lawsuits lack merit, they're overwhelmingly successful because defendants often don't show up in court and don't respond in a timely manner. As much as 90% of the time, the defendant in a consumer debt lawsuit in New York fails to respond. And when a defendant does show up in one of those cases, the collectors often give up rather than try to prove the debt exists. So it seems like an area where a little bit of helpful advice could go a long way. So the Reverend here teamed up with a company called Upsolve, which is a nonprofit, co-founded and currently chaired by Rohan Pavaluri, that is dedicated to helping Americans access their civil legal rights for free. Upsolve began by offering a free app to walk you through a Chapter 7 bankruptcy. And it's an award-winning innovation that has now helped relieve hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. Now, bankruptcy was only a start. Upsolve's next project was the American Justice Movement, which was designed to train volunteers like the Reverend to give the basic legal advice people need to defend themselves against the sorts of debt collection suits that plague so many New Yorkers. Truth is that responding to these suits is not that complicated. This is simple. If you read the summons in Michigan, it goes, you are being sued. If you do not respond in a timely manner, a default judgment may be entered against you. But the key is that you've got to respond. Some people look at the complaint and go, how do I respond? What does that mean to respond? New York has even created a form that allows people to respond to a debt lawsuit by simply checking a handful of boxes on a form. But even that form is complicated for people who are unfamiliar with the legal system. So for instance, one box asks you to check whether or not you want to invoke the doctrine of laches. And the American Justice Movement is designed to bridge that gap by walking people through the form and answering simple questions such as, what is the doctrine of laches? The problem is the sort of advice contemplated by this project, where trained community advocates provide one-on-one advice, is currently a crime. If Reverend John, or someone like him, gives advice about how to respond to a lawsuit, it could land him in jail for up to 4 years for engaging in the unauthorized practice of law. And one thing I'm going to tell you is that there's a parallel to this in the medical industry. As some of you know, I recently went to an urgent care clinic, and I was not seen by a doctor. But people came in, examined me, came to conclusions about what was wrong with me, and then they left, and I left, and there you go. And I got some prescriptions that took care of me. And so were they practicing medicine without being doctors? Well, no. That industry has recognized that, well, you can have doctors, and then you can have these people in the middle who are trained to see certain things and look for certain things. But if it's over their head, they then bring in the doctor. And there'd be a doctor presumably someplace on the premises, although I never saw such a person. So that's why the Reverend John and Upsolve have teamed up with the Institute for Justice to challenge New York's prohibition on legal advice from people who are not lawyers under the First Amendment. After all, it cannot be a crime simply to give someone advice. If it were, the nation's jails would be filled with bartenders, barbers, and of course, meddling in-laws. They used aunts here, like aunts and uncles. I think in-laws better. The reason the nation's in-laws walk free is the First Amendment protects everyone's right to provide each other with advice, including on important topics like their legal rights. And indeed, for much of American history, advice like Reverend John's would have been perfectly legal. At the time of the American founding, courts restricted who could appear before a judge in court, but no one pretended to have the right to regulate who talked about the law outside of court. Those restrictions are just not anti-competitive, they're unconstitutional. Restrictions on who is allowed to talk about the law run afoul of the First Amendment, which protects all Americans' right to speak, whether it's about history or medicine or the law, vindicating that important principle to give all Americans, not just those who are lucky enough to have licensed attorneys on call, the ability to access useful information about their legal rights. So what they're doing here, what they're asking for, is simply allowing for people who are not attorneys to not be prosecuted if they talk to somebody and say, well, here, you could try this, you could do that. And you might say, but Steve, they're going to take your job. No, they're not. No, they're not. I don't make my money giving people advice about things like that. First of all, most attorneys will give you a free consultation if you sit down and just say you want to talk to them for a little while. But number two, the real key here is when you represent somebody. Now, I realize that attorneys do render advice and they also do represent people, but they're not saying that they want non-attorneys to be able to come into court and stand next to somebody and do all the lawyering, but without any training. They're not saying that. They're simply saying that if somebody walks into a clinic and says, hey, I got served with papers today, I don't know what these are. To have somebody go, oh, well, this is a lawsuit. When did you get this? Yesterday? Okay, well, you got 21 days to file a response to this. If you don't file a response, bad things are going to happen, which, by the way, it says right on the summons. But somebody might go, well, how do I respond to it? What is a response? Well, it turns out New York's actually got a response form that they've already filled out for you with just check boxes. Okay. And I don't think it takes an attorney to go through that and figure out which boxes to check. And if people simply file an answer, they can go into court by themselves if they want to. And I've seen people in court where a judge goes, do you have an attorney? No, I don't. Okay. And the judge just deals with them and understands that this person doesn't have an attorney and cuts them some more slack with respect to things like procedure and so on. So what they're really addressing is the law that says that you cannot render legal advice, and if you do, you're practicing law without a license if you render that legal advice and you're not an attorney. And I think that all that matters is whether or not the person is getting the advice understands it's coming from a non-lawyer. So if I walk up to somebody and say, hey, I got a question for you. I don't know you, but I got a question for you. I just got sued. What do I do? If you say, well, I'm not a lawyer, and you give me advice, I have no problem with that. The same way if I walked up to you and go, hey, I got this weird thing on my arm. What do you think that is? Well, I'm not a doctor, but looks like it could be a rash or something. Does it itch? How long you had it? Now, you might want to go to see a doctor. You might want to. I don't know. And so as long as the person doesn't pretend to be a lawyer or mislead the person they're giving their advice to, because everyone knows you can go get advice from anybody. I know people who will take advice from anybody and go, I was talking to a guy who said I should do this. And I'll ask and go, what does the guy do for a living? I don't know, but it made sense. But as long as you understand that the person's not an attorney, because a non-attorney who's been through the legal system or has been trained can give useful advice. And I have no problem with this at all. The bulk of my practice is I represent people who have defective automobiles and the manufacturers won't buy them back, and so I work to get the manufacturer to buy that vehicle back from them under a thing called the Lemon Law, which provides that attorney fees and court costs get paid by the defendants if I succeed on my client's behalf. So we're not talking about replacing me in that process, because that's something an attorney does. And so if somebody were to go to a non-attorney and go, hey, I got a problem with the Lemon Law, can you help me? Well, somebody who's not an attorney could probably say, gee, look it up and you'll see the Lemon Law has certain remedies, but it looks like you can get an attorney for free to handle that. Why wouldn't you? So I'm not worried at all about this affecting me personally in my little narrow niche of a profession within being a lawyer. But I think they just need to make two distinctions and make it clear that a non-attorney cannot come into court and act like an attorney just because they want to play an attorney. And they watched a lot of Perry Mason. And number two, they have to disclose when they're giving advice. By the way, I'm not an attorney, but I've had a little bit of training, or I've done this before, I've seen this form before, and I've helped people with these forms before. Okay? And so if you go to your next door neighbor and you're leaning over the fence and you ask your neighbor a legal question, and if they go, well, I'm not a lawyer, but what they say beyond that shouldn't be illegal. Should it? So I have no problem with this. And I can tell you that this is not taking work away from lawyers either, for one other reason. And that is that most of these people cannot afford attorneys. Can't afford attorneys. So if you say that they must hire attorneys or they get no help at all, well, we're right where we are right now. They can't get any help and they can't afford attorneys. And so bad things happen to these people. So I often think that what we need to do from time to time is step back and simply look at a situation and ask ourselves, is this situation okay? And if not, is there something we can do to help? And so if it appears that there are 300,000 lawsuits filed in New York City each year on debts, just simple debt collection, and that many of them would go away if the defendant simply responded, a solution here might be to find a way to get these people help so that they can respond. And if that involves a non-lawyer giving them a tiny little bit of advice, trust me, what they're telling them to do with respect to filing an answer to a complaint ain't the brain surgery part of our job. And it won't affect lawyers at all because, as I pointed out, most of these people couldn't afford lawyers in the first place. So there you go. So it's a right to provide legal advice, and that's what the Institute for Justice is pushing for in New York. And despite the fact that some people think that they're coming for my job, they ain't. And I still love the Institute. And I've mentioned before, I'll put the link to them in the description below. They do great work. And so if you're so inclined, please check out their website, look at the type of work they do. And if you can, donate a couple bucks because they're a nonprofit. They operate entirely based on the generosity of people who've heard of them and have decided to support the good work they do. Questions or comments? Put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. May every sunrise hold more promise and every sunset hold more peace.